Well, for today's reading, we find ourselves in 1 John. This is the first letter of John the Apostle, who also wrote the Gospel of John. And the letter carries on many of the themes or metaphors of John's Gospel. You read in there light and dark and belief and unbelief and truth and lies. These are all things that we find in John's Gospel. And the letter is written to the house churches that John pastored in Asia Minor, what is now the eastern coast of modern-day Turkey. If you notice, the portion of John's letter that you just read repeats the phrase, "This is how we know." 3 times we read that expression. First, this is how we know what love is. Second, this is how we know we belong to the truth and can set our hearts at rest. And finally, this is how we know that He, that is God, lives in us. They are really what John's bringing up to his church here, 3 matters that are essential for our well-being as humans. And I want to look at each of them here briefly in this teaching. First, John says to us, this is how we know what love is. It makes me think about way back in 1993, there was a Trinidadian German singer, and I admit I had to look this up. His name was Hadaway, and he released a pop song that became a global smash hit. It also became one of the biggest earworms of all time. And in the song, he asked the question, what is love? And while I hate to do this because I know that what I'm about to do is going to ruin all of your days, let's listen to just a little bit of his answer. And by the way, if this ends up jumping just to the next section of the teaching, it's because I had to take this out for copyright reasons. But let's give it a whirl here anyway.
What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more. What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more.
Okay, so what is love? Oh, baby, don't hurt me no more. That's not much of an answer. And apparently, Hadaway hadn't recently read these words of John, because if he had have, he likely would have come up with a much better lyric. John tells us that the answer to the question is seen in Jesus Christ's self-sacrifice, right? In laying down his life for us, we learn what love is. To love is to lay down your life for another. And John then immediately shifts the conversation from Jesus' example to our own lives. He says that, like Jesus, we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. This is something we ought to do. It's how we should live our lives. And then he links it, you'll see, to our pocketbooks. That if we see another who is lacking, but we do not have pity on them, then how can we actually say that God's love is in us? There's a direct link to our active compassion. And in John's usual direct fashion, he puts the screws right into our lives. If you're not caring for people, addressing their real needs, sacrificing so that others might be cared for, you are not living as you ought, which is an expression that I love, ought. This is how we ought to live. This is the life of love. It's the way of Jesus, the way we ought to live. And he concludes this first, this is how we know, by this expression really of tender pastoral direction. Dear children, he says, which is a phrase of fatherly care that John often uses for his churches. Let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and the truth. In other words, don't just talk about love. Talking about love costs us absolutely nothing. And he says, or we see in the scriptures, that just the talk of things is really the way of the hypocrites. Instead, we are to live the way of love. We are to sacrifice, we are to serve. And I wonder how these words sit with you. Maybe it's something that you can talk about a little bit more together in your church. Well, second, John says to the church, and this is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence. Before we go ahead, just think about those words. Belong to the truth. Set our hearts at rest in his presence. We're prone to think of this word truth as more of a set of beliefs or articles of belief. Truths are laws, they are rules, they are things that we accept as fact. But the way John finishes the sentence implies he has another definition of truth in mind. This is how we know we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence. You see, truth for John is personal. Truth is the person of Jesus. Truth is God expressed in the person of Jesus. Remember what John recorded Jesus saying in the gospel? He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So what is true then, according to John, is the person of Jesus. What is truth? It is Jesus. It's not so much a set of laws, but it is a person. This person defines for us what is true. And John wants us to know that we can belong to him and that we can be at rest in his presence. He begins verse 21 by acknowledging that in our hearts, that is, in our inner person, we may feel condemned before God. We may contemplate God. We may feel the opposite of rest as we do so. We may feel we do not belong to God. Perhaps that's your experience. You feel in your heart condemned before God. I encounter this often in people's lives, and truth be told, there are often times in my own life where I feel as though I'm condemned before God. But John brings us comfort, and he tells us that God is greater than our hearts, that he knows all. He understands all, that our hearts and their experience then do not win the day with God. And I wonder if that could just seep into our presence. What we feel is not the final word when it comes to how we understand God's view of us. But then he continues, if our hearts do not condemn us, we can have then confidence before God, which, given what we just said, should cause us, I think, to perk up a little bit. Not only do we not feel condemned or need to feel condemned, we can actually then, the opposite of that, we can actually have confidence before God. We could, as he said in the opening sentence, have rest before God. That's quite a thought, to have rest before God. Now, how could that be? Well, he tells us that we have confidence because we keep his commands and do what pleases God. And then, as if he's reading our minds, he then answers the question that's on our minds. He tells us the commands of God to believe, to have faith in Jesus, and to love one another. That's it. How do we know that we belong to the truth? How can we, as followers of Jesus, set our hearts at rest in God's presence? We believe, we set our hearts in faith upon Jesus, this truth personified, and then we live a life like his, seeking to love. That, you could sum it all up. That's the entirety of the Godward life John gives this church in one simple expression. We place faith in Jesus as the way and the truth, and we go about living lives doing the works of love. You could boil it down. That is the Christian experience. And finally, he closes the section then with this one final, this is how. This is how we know that he lives in us. And the presumption here is that he's referencing to is God. And the answer, John says, really quite matter-of-factly, is that we know by the Spirit that God gives to us. In Ephesians chapter 1, Paul will tell us that upon our confession of faith in Jesus, we are marked with a seal, the promised Holy Spirit. I've talked about this many times before. And I think this is what John is in reference here too, that as we have faith in Jesus, as we rest in him, we are given then the Holy Spirit. And in John's gospel, when Jesus was teaching his disciples about the Holy Spirit, just before he went to the cross, he promised to them that the Holy Spirit would be given to us as an advocate, as someone that would act on our behalf, who would assure to us that we are not just friends of God, but we are actually even closer. We are sons of daughters of God. And he told us that this Spirit, the very Spirit of God, would dwell in us. This is what Jesus says in John chapter 14, as I say, the night before he goes to the cross. He says, if you love me, keep my commands. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another, an advocate, to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him, but you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. You see all those crossover themes between John's gospel and the letter that he's writing here? So many themes we picked up. I even just reading it there, I thought, oh, I didn't talk about that. I didn't talk about that. It's incredible. Well, how do we know what love is? We see it in the crucified body of Jesus laid down for the world. And this we see is the way that we are to live. How do we know that we belong to the truth with our hearts at rest in the presence of God? Well, we have believed in the Son of God, Jesus Christ, and we have then set our lives on the way of love as demonstrated in Jesus. And how do we know that God lives in us? We know because he's given us a spirit, and the Spirit lives within us, and the Spirit is an advocate to us, reminding us that we are sons and daughters of God. Now, if you do not believe in the Son, my prayer for you is that as you listen to this, that you would have faith to believe in Jesus, that he is the truth, truth personified. And if you do believe, but you feel condemned in your hearts today, I just bless you, and may you know that God is greater than your hearts, and may you feel, even right now as I teach, just the sweet whisper of the Spirit that speaks to you and says to you, you are his and he is yours, you are together. And in all things then, may we then go out from here, setting ourselves on the greater things. May we be people that live the love of Jesus, that live, not just speak of love, but actually live the love of Jesus to the world around us. And for those of you that may be coming to the Citywide next week, we'll pick up on this theme a little bit more there. The Lord be with you as you discuss this important passage together.